Hello and welcome to NONI, Yanga's flagship talk show, where we discuss the topics that you, our viewers at home, are talking about just that little bit louder. I'm Afua Adom, and today I'll be seeing if my guests agree that we should let kids vote at 16. So, who are my guests? Well, joining me today are political commentator Helen Femi.
Hi.
Another Femi, co-founder of Our Future, Our Choice, Femi Olawole.
Hi.
And content creator and confidence coach Nissi T.
Hi.
Welcome, panel. Thank you so much for coming. At 16, you're eligible to pay taxes, you can leave home, you can get married, you can even join the armed forces, but you can't vote in a general election. That's another 2 years away when you turn 18. So, should we lower the voting age? All the main opposition parties are for the change, but the current Conservative government are dead against it, which is strange, as this year they allowed members aged 15, 16 and 17 to vote in their leadership elections. Could it be because they believe that support for it is nothing more than a cynical ploy that would introduce a demographic more likely to vote against them? They claim those under 18 don't have sufficient maturity and responsibility to vote in elections. And a 2013 YouGov poll appears to back their decision, with 60% of British adults opposed to the idea and only 20% supporting it. So, what do we think, panel? Are we being unfair to our teenagers by denying them a say in the democratic process? Let's discuss. The voting age is currently 18. Should we let 16 and 17-year-olds vote? Nissi T, what do you think?
So when I first hear this, I'm kind of in between. So part of me feels like, yes, we should, because I listen to the types of conversations that my siblings talk about now. So I've got 3 younger sisters, one of which is 16 and the rest varying in ages.
And are they engaged in politics?
100%.
Okay.
So, you know, compared to the conversations that I heard other people having when I was 16 and when I was in school, just hearing how engaged they are, how interested they are, how much they want to be involved in politics shows that there's a bit of an advancement happening now in general. I think because of social media and access to a wide range of just things in general, I feel like young people feel like they should be a part of that conversation. So to some degree, I do think it might be a good idea, but there's also that part of me that worries, thinking, actually, are they mature enough? Do they, really know what they want? So I'm quite in between, actually.
Femi, could our 16-year-olds just be really politically swayed by one party, be persuaded, all of them, en masse, to vote for one party? I don't think so.
I don't think so. Well, not any more than any other age group. I mean, we've seen that political persuasion works. We have people who, as a result of Brexit, voted heavily against their own interests in 2016. And not to mention, in terms of young people, 73% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted Remain in 2016. And the age group, according to polling below them, an age group that is now 18, is even more in favour of staying in the EU. So and they're the generation most affected by it.
So do we think if we had 16 and 17-year-olds voting, perhaps we wouldn't be where we are in this current political climate?
Absolutely. I mean, overwhelmingly, the generation most affected by Brexit does not want it. And that's the kind of the problem here. If you're 16 years old, you can get yourself a part-time job, which means you can contribute to the economy, but you don't get a say over that.
So you're paying taxes, but you're not necessarily deciding on the things you're being taxed for.
It's taxation without representation.
But don't we think, there's a saying, or there's a school of thought that says that you get more right-wing as you get older. So isn't this perhaps just a ploy by, a party like Labour to get lots of young people to vote for them, sweeping them into power, Helen?
I wouldn't necessarily say it. To be honest, I feel, we're asking the wrong question, because you can be 16 or you can be 56, and if you're politically illiterate, it doesn't matter. So voting at 16 itself is not really changing anything that we have, because you can meet 16-year-olds who are very politically engaged, and that can be Labour, that can be Conservatives. I think 16-year-olds do have their own brains and are able to kind of have that conversation, but equally that you could say the exact same thing about someone who was 56. So I think Brexit, like you just mentioned, is a good example of showing that actually we need to actually have a politically educated class of people, rather than it being about the age you vote. Because I don't think if you're 16 and you're younger that it means that you don't have a brain, or you can't make your mind up, or that you're easily influenced. It just means that you're just a certain age.
Well, what about our 18 to 19-year-olds? That demographic don't vote. It's we've got statistics that say that they're the least likely to vote, that there's a huge amount of apathy amongst that voting age. Is lowering the voting age going to change that in any
So
way?
here's the thing. Because the voting age is currently 18, that means that the average person doesn't actually get the first opportunity to vote until they're, 21 and a half? And so you're telling an entire group of the population below the age of 21 and a half that politics just isn't for you. It doesn't concern you. So you're actually creating that voter apathy by having such a high voter age. If you put the voting age at 16, then the question of who you're going to vote for and why would enter every high school in the country. And the conversation would be, they'd be even more politically engaged because they have the opportunity to do something about
So
it.
it's about engaging young people earlier on.
Yeah.
But I disagree, because you can go to university and you can say like everyone at university is at the age of voting, but university students are the least likely to vote because, you know, it's long filling out the paperwork for your home address and your university address. So why aren't we having those types of conversation at universities? And you can say there are people who are having them, but equally there are loads of people who don't, or just can't be bothered to do it because it's just long for them.
To a degree, I think it's a lot to do with accessibility as well. So kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying earlier, I think, first of all, being able to kind of narrow that gap between politics and young people in general, because I do think that for a lot of people, the reason why they don't vote is because they don't even understand what's happening in the first place. Ask them, have you read a manifesto? They don't even know what that is. Ask them, do you even know what some of the policies, some of the people, you know, the leaders that are around now that they want to implement? They would have no idea. So I think actually we should be having a conversation around accessibility. So removing the jargon, allowing people from different backgrounds to be able to actually engage in the conversation, because I know for a fact I come from a very working class background. I come from inner city London. A lot of inner city youth feel like they can't even have the conversation because they don't even speak the language before even getting into a place of saying, oh, actually, yeah, I do know what's happening. How can you engage in something that you don't have access to? So I think, you know.
But just because you're 60, does that mean that you now engage and you now have access and you now know anything?
No, if you're 60, you've had, you know, quite a few general elections in your life. You will have seen this process go round and round quite a few times, surely.
But that doesn't mean that you're engaging. That doesn't actually mean that you vote. That doesn't mean that you vote in your local elections, which are probably going to affect you more than general elections. That doesn't mean that you are a member of a party. Just because general elections happen, it's very easy not to participate and not to do anything political. I think in this day and age, people are becoming more binary and polarized and do actually have opinions on things. But equally, if you wanted to ignore it and just pretend it's not happening, that's something you can do even if you are beyond the age of 18 and you are allowed to vote.
Yeah, I've met many people who say that, people who are 50, 60 who say they've given up on politics entirely.
Wow.
And as for the issue regarding how do you make it accessible, that's entirely the point. When I go to do school visits and I speak to 16, 17-year-olds, I won't lie. Often I get the case that I say, all right, who cares about politics in this room? And very few hands will go up. I'll then say, all right, who cares about how much stuff costs in the shops?
Right.
All the hands go up. Who cares about whether or not you can get a job when you leave school?
Yeah.
All the hands go up. Who cares whether or not you have the right to live, work, and love in another country of the EU? All the hands go up.
Right.
Every single one of those is directly affected by politics. By the end of that conversation, they're all interested in politics.
That's because young people don't make the connection between the things that affect them every day and the government. But isn't it time we had a bit of, I mean, we've gone through a digital revolution. Isn't it time that we brought that into politics? And like you talked about university students finding it difficult to vote because they've got to register at home and at university. Why can't we vote digitally? Why can't we do it on an app? Why do we have to go to a polling station, fill out all this paperwork? Femi, are we near a point where this could happen?
I think that's where we should be heading. I think we are at an age where the government can do a whole bunch of stuff which is highly sensitive online, yet voting isn't allowed to do it. They don't do it that way. I think we're missing a major opportunity to get a lot of people involved and engaged in this, because pretty much everything happens online, so why not this?
But you've seen a lot of people who, you talked about Brexit, people who voted against their own self-interest, you know, especially in that vote. Are young people mature enough to make those kinds of decisions?
Well, ultimately it depends on the degree of information that's out there, how much information they're being given. For example, it is a failure of education that even me sitting here right now, none of my education involved a lesson about the history of Ireland, whereas we just had a major decision which massively affects Ireland, and I had I was completely unprepared. I mean, I studied EU law for 2 years in 2 different universities in 2 different languages. And even I would say that I was ill-informed when I made my decision about Brexit because I had no idea how it would affect the Irish border. And at school, we learn what? We learn First World War, Second World War, King Henry VIII, and that's about it. We don't touch anything to do with the Ireland, which is literally next door.
Yeah. And how do we change that, though? That's the thing. If we're going to talk about lowering the voter age and talk about engaging our young people and getting them more involved in the political process, Felicity, what do we do?
Yeah, I was going to say as well, it's quite funny that we speak about maturity just before I go into that, because it seems like a lot of the people in Parliament, we need to ask them if they're even mature, because it seems like they're not. So maturity definitely does not come with age. It doesn't come necessarily even with experience anymore. So I think to say whether or not our young people are mature or not is the wrong question. And in terms of engaging people, I think there are a lot of people that are actually doing so. I know just hearing what these guys have been doing, you know, to try and engage young people in politics is absolutely amazing. But I think it's really important that our government, who are supposed to be serving the people, engage with people who are on the ground level, people like yourselves who are going into schools. You know, there's loads of organizations out there. I know one called My Life, My Say, who again bring people, young people in to engage in conversation. So if there was something or somewhere where the government could partner with these people that are on the ground, I think that would really, really help. But then again, you know, you ask the question, well, do they really want to do that? Do they want to get people politically involved? Because then it could go against their own interests. So
I would say, you know, you have so many informal institutions, like when I talk about informal institutions, I'm talking about the internet and social media and people who, you know, will sit there all day commenting, giving their opinion on political situations. And I think that's what most young people do, and that's their way of being active. But that does not translate into actually the political system. So just because you know you have an opinion, and you know, Twitter is an example of somewhere where your opinion can grow, but sometimes because it's in this realm, it doesn't translate into actual reality, and then people get frustrated because they're talking, they think this is how it should, but they don't engage in the formal institutions. Now the formal institutions do need to change. So for instance, a good example of that is where you actually go to vote. Like if you think about where you always go to vote, it's usually in some like random community centre that you've never been in for the past like 4 years, and the last time you were there it was because you were voting, or some old church that no one goes to. It's always basically in places that are out of touch with society and out of touch with just what people are doing. And I think that is like one of the issues to engage people. So I do think we're far off from like this digital revolution where people can go and vote, and I can see the issues with that. But I think it's actually more just making, like kind of what you said, but making politics accessible. So changing where you go to vote, changing what, you know, how we vote, like first past the post, and changing the membership thing, because most young people are not going to join Labour or Conservatives, and if you do, you're probably like a political weirdo, like the people sitting in front of you. You're basically not the average young person, because why would you, even £2, you're going to be like, why would I spend that? Which is fair enough. And I think even the fact that the way we elect a leader comes from these political parties that are so out of touch with just people is something that needs to change, the membership system and stuff like that. And until you sort of really tackle the formal institutions of politics in this country, you can't really talk on the informal ways of changing politics.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. Okay, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to talk about why we think the incumbent government is so afraid of young people, and do they need to be? See you after the break. Welcome back to NONI with me, Afua Adom, and my guests Helen Femi Olawale and Nissi T. So the question we were discussing before the break was whether we should let kids vote at 16. Now I think it's worth pointing out that when Austria lowered its voting age, they created a generation of more habitual voters, but they didn't really change the political landscape. So do we think the incumbent government are scared of young people? And do we have to change the behaviour to create a new one? Panel, what do we think? So our incumbent government are the only political party at the moment who are against the idea of younger people voting. So Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and all the rest think it's a good idea. Now, do we think that is because if 16 and 17-year-olds had the vote, we would have a change of government in the next general election, Femi?
Yeah, absolutely. Just straight up. Conservatives are responsible for Brexit, largely, and young people voted heavily against Brexit. My age group, 25 to 34, voted 62% against Brexit. The age 18 to 24 voted 75% against Brexit.
Wow.
If they let younger people vote, 16, 17-year-olds, even more anti-Brexit, they're out of government. And not to mention, not just because we have a different ideology, but because as punishment for what they've done to this country for the past 3 years. And the idea that you shouldn't let young people vote because of how it might change things is a fundamentally undemocratic thing. It's basically saying, let's keep these views out of politics. I mean, my group is obviously pushing for a new referendum, and there's talk about whether or not we should let 16, 17-year-olds vote. And the argument against that is saying, oh, how can you're just trying to skew the result. You're just trying to skew the result by letting young people vote. Yeah, it's never undemocratic to give more people a voice.
Absolutely. But then in the leadership election for the Conservative Party, which gave us a new Prime Minister, thanks for that, 15, 16 and 17-year-olds who are a member of the Conservative Party were allowed to vote in that leadership election. Now, do we think that's perhaps because they've been means tested, so they've joined a political party, showing that we have some sort of engagement? Do you think that's why they were allowed to vote?
Yeah, definitely. I think, that was a very strategic way of doing it. You didn't just leave anyone to come up with this vote that could vote either way, but you chose people who almost, it's going to sound really insane, but almost like you've groomed them. You've brought them into your party, you've groomed them, you've shown them what it is that you believe and maybe the policies that you're standing for and why it's so important to vote Conservative. And then you've said, okay, now here, have your vote. That is, skewing the truth of what could have potentially happened with that. So yeah, I definitely don't think that was a good way of going about it.
Not to mention the Tories have a serious youth problem because young people just don't vote for them. So if they're going to throw the young people a carrot, this is the one they could throw.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're talking about 0.35%, like 0.35% of the population actually took part in that vote.
Like 1% of 1% or something, right?
Exactly. So in that sense, it's fine to allow a section of that. I mean, and as well, the majority of Conservative voters are over the age of 55.
So as you get older, you get more right wing.
Not necessarily, but that is like kind of the makeup of a Tory member. So if they have issues with letting young people vote, young people voting for them, within that tiny percentage that you already have, having just an even tiny percentage voting, and that's something they can control. Like you can control the leadership of the next party because it's within Tories. But if you're talking about a general election, that's completely out of their control.
So how do we cater to get more young Black Britons like us to vote? Like, how do we get Black British young people more engaged across all the parties, Labour, Conservative? How can we do that, Helen?
I mean, I think there is this perception that, just because you're a minority, you're going to vote Labour. And I think that's actually something that a lot of the other parties can touch on. So, I mean, there are Tory MPs that are Black. There are Tory. Do you know what I mean? It's not Labour doesn't equal Black, and I think actually other parties kind of tapping into that and giving their policies to making sure their policies are known to minorities and what they can do for minorities would actually allow a bigger portion of the population to vote, because it wouldn't just be I'm voting Labour because my parents voted Labour and because I'm a minority and they like immigration or something. It would be you making an informed decision that you might be a Lib Dem or you might be a Tory. Potentially you could be, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think, it's about engagement and it's about activism. So if you want to vote Tory and you're Black, like you should, and you shouldn't feel ashamed of that.
Yeah, because you should just vote.
That's your own though.
So Femi, how are we going to do that? How are we going to encourage young Black Britons to get out there?
On that point, I just want to add, I think there has been a certain degree of complacency from Labour in terms of, we own the Black vote, and it's even just not just we own the Black vote, we own the left as a general rule. That anybody who's lefty will automatically vote for us. I mean, why do you think for the past 2 years Labour has been wishy-washy on Brexit when they knows that 71% of its voters voted against Brexit? Because it knows that it can do whatever it wants. It feels that it has ownership of it. How to get more Black people involved in politics? It's a tipping scale. I mean, you have to get Black people involved in politics so that other Black people see themselves reflected in politics and feel like they want to get involved. I mean, one of the things around Brexit for me personally was that at the start when I started campaigning, I didn't know, I had doubts whether or not I should even get involved in this. Because I, like many black people around the country, would have seen that result and seen it as a rejection of myself. Especially given the narrative that was used to win that referendum from Nigel Farage, which was fundamentally racist. When he showed that Breaking Point poster, let's not forget, he was pointing at Syrian refugees saying, let's leave the EU so we can control our borders, when the UK isn't part of the EU's common asylum policy, which means that not one of the people in that photograph had any rights to enter the UK under EU law. So he chose people who had nothing to do with Brexit, but visually, they're what he thought would be more scary to people who were worried about immigration, which makes it fundamentally racist. So for that kind of narrative to win, it felt like a massive rejection. And so that's why I was wondering whether I should even get involved in this politics. Am I no longer welcome in the political sphere? But I felt it was important to make the point that we're still here, that they will not dictate who gets to be British. And I think that by getting involved, by putting myself out there, by making sure that other black people see themselves reflected in political discourse, I think that's one of the steps you need to make so that other black people get involved.
But you've stuck your head above the parapet, especially when it comes to Brexit. What kind of racism have you faced?
Ooh, okay, so that's a big one.
That's a big question.
Pretty much everything under the sun, ranging from
Go back to where you come from.
go back to Africa. Very. I mean, that they often say that. They'll sometimes say it in other ways, like other really weird ways, just to make it. It ultimately means go back to Africa, but they don't say it quite that way. They find a more British way of saying it.
Oh yes.
But everything like somebody tried to accuse my parents of genocide.
Wow.
Just out of left field, and that was a verified account that did that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've heard it all.
Pretty much everything, and I get abuse every second, pretty much on Twitter. Racial abuse every day, 2 days. Threats of violence every couple of weeks. No, maybe a week. I think it's gone on to a week now. And in February last year, somebody posted my home address online.
Wow.
It's an issue.
Wow.
But ultimately, the more I experience of this, the more I realize this is not acceptable and must be fought. So the worse it gets, the more you realize you have to fight it.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Nissy T, would you ever take up a cause like that, put your head above the parapet so much to fight for something?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say how, incredibly amazing you are to even experience all of that abuse and to be constantly being pushed back, but to feel like, no, there's a cause and there's a reason. So, hats off to you. But I think 100%, we all have a voice and we all need to use our voice. So, a lot of people know me for my YouTube channel, and on my YouTube channel, I, talk about and discuss a whole range of different topics. And it was funny because we were talking earlier and I was saying how I want to go back into a space where I talk on, more current affairs and political issues, because I do feel like representation is everything. The narrative is everything. And I'm so glad that you touched on it, because people literally are, people go with what they see. So if they see that there's nobody that looks like them, nobody that's engaged in the conversation like them, nobody that is, speaking to someone like themselves directly or to their background, their culture, they will not get involved. So it does take for people to stand up and say, listen, we are going to fight, we are going to speak up, we are going to use our voices, and I definitely know that I can do so much more and I can do so much better. It's just reignited a flame in me to say, yeah, we need to really have these conversations. So changing the narrative is the most important thing, and showing people that actually, listen, like you said, I am British too. I have just as much of a right to be involved in this conversation as anybody else. So,
and bring it back to young people voting. Of course, that was that 2013 YouGov poll that said around 60% of British people didn't want younger people of 16 and 17-year-olds to get the vote. How do we change their minds? Can we change their minds?
Well, ultimately, if you've got an older generation that has a certain worldview, it's not in their interest to let a younger generation that has a different worldview have a say. I mean, you've heard the phrase, freedom isn't given, it's taken. It doesn't matter if the older generation doesn't want us to have the young people to have the vote. they deserve the vote.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we also need to really address the way we perceive who should be involved in politics as well. So as you were saying, you've met young people who are half your age but know so much as well. I think this whole traditionalist view that we have of politics, that it is male, pale and stale, needs to go out of the window now. We are gone past those days. There could be a young black boy in East London wearing a tracksuit who will probably be able to tell you a lot more about politics just as much as anybody else. So I think this image that we have of what politics looks like, whether it be people in suits or whether it be people shouting in the Houses of Parliament, I think we really need to start morphing it into what we want it to be. You know, and that starts within our own communities and within our own backgrounds to say, listen, you can, you know, have an afro and you can be interested in politics. You can wear a tracksuit, you can be interested in politics. I think a lot of it is imagery as well, because a lot of young people then see that and they're like, oh, well, eventually they get to a point, oh, well, nobody really looks like me or no one talks like me, so maybe I shouldn't necessarily, you know, engage with it as well.
But I think that goes back to something I said earlier about institutions, because like you're talking about a young black boy in East London. Fair enough, he has an opinion, and I don't doubt that what he said is probably eloquent and amazing, but he's not going to, or in this sort of realm, he may not use the formal institutions to actually get his voice heard. He might tell his friends, he might tell his family, he might even go to church and talk about it, but he's not necessarily, or potentially he's not you know, joining youth parliament. He's not participating in policy consultations. Now, I think that system is flawed. Like I said, the formal institutions are flawed. But if you don't have boys like that going to the formal institutions and showing themselves represented, joining the Labour Party and actually, or the Conservatives or whatever, and actually being visible and being seen, then where it really just stays is in his little realm of space. It actually has to go to the formal institutions to change the formal institutions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, guys. Amazing. That's it from me, Afua Adom, and my fantastic guests, Helen Femi Olawale, and Missy T. Thank you so much for joining me. And don't forget, every single episode of NONI, past and present, is online at yangatv.com. So wherever you are in the world, you can see this show and other great content from Yanga. Join us again soon for more entertaining chat. Goodbye.